And so tonight, we have Jonathan Head, who is well known to everybody as a former president of the club, BBC's Southeast Asia correspondent. He is, as you can see, sitting down in Kuala Lumpur. And we're extremely pleased also to have Bridget Welsh, who's joining us from Sydney in Australia, on her way back to Rome. She's a very busy lady. I haven't worked out what her itineraries are. But she's a specialist in Malaysian politics, an associate professor of political science at John Cabot University in Rome, a senior research associated at the Centre for East Asia Democratic Studies of the National Taiwan University, and a senior associate fellow at the Habibie Centre in Jakarta, and a university fellow of Charles Darwin University in Darwin. Now, her recent book was published in 2016, and was presciently titled The End of UMNO, Essays on Malaysia's Dominant Party. She also edited Reflections, The Mahathir Years 2004, and Awakening Abdullah Badawi's Years in Malaysia 2013. So we couldn't have a better person to talk to tonight. We also have in Bangkok Phil Robertson, who is the Deputy Director of US-based Human Rights Watch in Asia, and he's been analysing Malaysia over a 7-year period and has launched 5 reports on the situation in the country. And finally, we're very pleased to have at very short notice Matthew Hayes, who is the Resident Director of the International Republican Institute in Thailand, and also he covers Malaysia. His program covers Malaysia and has done so since 2015. In Malaysia, he's been working with political parties from both the opposition and ruling coalitions for the last 5 years. He's speaking tonight in a strictly personal capacity, but he joined IRI in 2013 as a program officer for Thailand, Malaysia, East Timor, and Vietnam. Right, so that's who we've got, and we're very pleased to have them. Now, we're going to kick off with Jonathan, who is in Kuala Lumpur. Jonathan, can you hear me clearly?
You're not very clear, but I can hear you at the moment.
You can hear. Well, we can hear you quite clearly, so don't get put off by it. Now, you're there. You've been actually there for the last fortnight, pretty much. What's happening at the moment?
I'm glad I got that last bit, Dominic. I have to learn lip reading. Look, it's an extraordinary atmosphere at the moment. We're only just over a week from this extraordinary general election result that has transformed this country. I would say perhaps Anwar Ibrahim's release yesterday was the last great celebration, the big moment that had to happen. Of course, there's a massive agenda for this new government, a huge amount on their plates, but this actual sense of a transformation that they had not predicted, very few people here had, they were just, I think even the opposition leaders were astonished by their result. I was interviewing Fahmi Fadzil, who was in the old days a personal assistant to Anwar Ibrahim's daughter in the constituency here in Petaling Jaya, Lembah Pantai. And he took over her constituency because it had been so gerrymandered by Barisan Nasional, with a police barracks, almost all vote for the government, being slid inside the constituency boundaries, that it was almost a given that he would lose. He campaigned very energetically, but totally assumed he would lose. He increased her majority significantly. He was stunned afterwards. This is one of those very rare moments where we are all caught flat-footed, and where quite clearly a momentum got going for a certain political direction that caught everyone here. The optimism, the hope they could do it. It was just, I have to say, you have to take your hat off to Malaysian voters for making such an enormous effort to overcome the immense advantages that the ruling party had. So that euphoria is still here, that sense of disbelief, the excitement that they've achieved something that everybody told them couldn't be done. It was quite incredible to watch former Prime Minister Najib Razak, right after the election, literally visibly crumbling in front of our eyes. A man who'd been propped up by one of the most powerful ruling parties in this region. And he was worried, certainly, but I think he'd assumed that all the efforts he'd made to swing the election his way would pull off. Even at the end, Anwar Ibrahim was telling me that he was phoned up by Najib on the night as the results started to come in, Najib still couldn't believe that he wouldn't be able to do a deal, that he wouldn't be able somehow to stay in power. And it was only really on Thursday, and there were clearly some very tense hours on election night where it wasn't clear whether Najib, the Election Commission, the police and others would actually allow the results to come out, whether there might not be a state of emergency. Mahathir Mohamad showed, as he so often has in this campaign, his extraordinary dexterity and experience in managing those desperate few hours, in corralling the winning MPs, declaring victory very early on, very bold move, and eventually forcing the hand of people who might otherwise have wavered. And by about the middle of the day after the election on the 10th of May, it was quite clear that Barisan couldn't come back. They didn't have enough seats. And so it's wonderful to be here. It's been amazing to watch it. It is fascinating to watch Mahathir Mohamad moving so fast now to try and cement the control of his new government. Interesting also, having spent the day at Anwar's house yesterday, to listen to Anwar Ibrahim publicly saying he is happy to leave his one-time mentor and, of course, eventual rival and jailer to run the government as he sees fit. Anwar says he will stay hands-off, that he doesn't want to get involved in politics at the moment. Realistically, Anwar's party is the largest in the governing coalition, and we saw a parade of figures. It was mostly the Chinese Democratic Action Party coming to his house to discuss cabinet positions. Mahathir is moving very boldly, and some might say quite precipitously, with the cabinet. It's interesting seeing the big cabinet positions going to himself. He's taking on the education portfolio as well, despite some concern among reformers that Prime Minister should only hold one post. And we've seen some of his allies, like Muhyiddin, getting the Home Affairs Ministry. I'm not sure how much agreement there is on the cabinet post going out. I think there's a lot of bargaining. But Mahathir is clearly, he's racing through to get his government established. The other members of the coalition who are watching him say they're absolutely in awe of him. This is a man who knows how to do it, and many of them recognize they perhaps don't have the skills. So we are seeing a genuinely powerful 92-year-old Prime Minister, a man who came late to the opposition, being allowed for the moment to cement his authority. And of course, critically, what we've seen in the last few days is the moves to investigate Najib gathering pace, with the travel ban very hastily brought through on Saturday, when it was discovered that Najib and his wife were planning to leave for Indonesia. They're now on a blacklist along with a lot of other officials related to the 1MDB scandal. Najib's house was raided last night along with 4 other buildings, including the Prime Minister's office. A very thorough search. The police were there for hours. His friends feel almost insulted that they would do this on the sort of the night before Ramadan, when he'd just come back from prayers. They're making it very clear, and of course, no coincidence, that happened on the day that Anwar, who was jailed by Najib, was released. And so we're now seeing, we've seen a special committee set up today. There's a council of eminent persons who are going to lead the reform movement. They've set up a separate committee to investigate 1MDB. So everybody expects the reopening of the investigation. That's what it is, because of course there was an ongoing investigation in Malaysia until the Attorney General was sacked in 2015. They expect that now to move very quickly. So I'll just leave you there with a sense of what it's like to be here, what the atmosphere has been like during the election. And I'll let you now perhaps play that short interview with Anwar Ibrahim that I did yesterday, and then Bridget, I know, has far stronger insights than I do on what happens next, and indeed what the actual campaign was like and the dynamics there.
All right, just for the benefit of people here, Jonathan will disappear in about 15 minutes to do some broadcasting, and then he'll rejoin us, so just let you know. So can we play the Anwar interview, which was yesterday? This is pretty brief. It's about 4 minutes.
I'm elated by this change. Not only here, friends throughout the world have been saying that, particularly in the Muslim world. There's a lot of gloom and despair in the last few years. Now there's a glimmer of hope that you can actually transform. So it is not tenable to defend an argument that Muslims are not ready for democracy.
How difficult has it been to make a deal with your former mentor, Dr Mahathir, then your rival? There's been a lot of bad blood between you in the past. It must have been quite tricky.
It was. Clearly quite difficult because although I said no Malays, but I had no intention of, you know, or see the necessity of working together. But then I think to Dr. Mahathir's credit, he came and said, look, the country is facing major challenges. We need to, you know, try and secure some sort of understanding and work together.
So he came to you, did he?
Yeah, he came to the court because they didn't allow him to visit the prison nor the hospital. So he came to court, and it was difficult, of course. You know, it's very, very, very difficult. I mean, people say, well, reconciliation. These are just technical terms, but we have to face it. It was difficult for Aziza and the family. I mean, our children were in tears because they thought, you know, why do you need to work with this guy? But then when we started to reason things out, they're part and parcel of the entire process. They're enthusiastic about the need to work together and to save Malaysia. So from there we started. We thought that we can cement this relationship. But I was very particular. I was on the reform agenda. I said I would not compromise or make a deal without a clear commitment to reform. But Mahathir said precisely, I'm not going to bid for UMNO presidency. I'm now with the people. I'm now with the opposition. I'm now with all you guys who are now committed to the reform agenda. And of course, people are still wary and a bit doubtful whether.
Do you trust him?
Frankly, I mean, initially I had my misgivings, but I think when we went through for month after month, seeing his speeches and receiving reports of meetings, and finally his commitment during the campaign. Some were a bit cynical in the past, saying that this is UMNO 2.0, but they realize you're dealing with a different man.
You think he is different? Has he really?
Yes,
does he really regret some of the things he's done?
He has made some statement to the effect that said, I should have sacked Anwar, I should have listened to these people, he should not, you know, things like that. Which I think went well, at least to my core supporters. But even had he not said that, I would still accept to say, look, we have to move on. We are talking about the country. We're talking about saving Malaysia.
Do you forgive him for what he did to you? Because he's responsible for your first long and difficult period in prison.
I do. I remember many friends, including Al Gore, joked with me, Anwar, are you sure you've forgiven him? I said, yes. And he said, why? I said, because there is a larger agenda, larger issue at stake. If you can dismantle the system that had perpetrated so much hardship and atrocities to the people, to the economic or political, then the Anwar factor is minimal in that sense. But here in this case, he was working with me as a team, and he publicly committed to lead the team and would surrender power at the right time.
Okay, so that was Anwar Ibrahim. Just recap, he was the Deputy Prime Minister from 1993 until 1998 when he was sacked by Mahathir in a dispute basically about how the financial crisis should be handled. He was jailed in 1999 on charges of sodomy, which people believe were trumped up, and he was released from prison in 2004 and returned to Parliament as leader of the opposition in 2008. The National Front was damaged by the 2013. So Anwar was again jailed in 2014 for the same charges. I think two interesting things out of the interview is that he looks quite a lot older than when we've seen him before, quite frail. He was in fact released from a hospital where he was being treated for a shoulder problem, I believe. So anyway, with that, over to Bridget. Can you hear us clearly, Bridget?
I can, but I have a bit of a weird echo, so it seems like there's some sort of authoritarian music in the background.
Yeah, that's normal for the FCCT. But if you just lean in steadily to your microphone, we can actually hear you very, very clearly. So I won't disturb you. I'll just let you get going.
Okay, it's good. Are we? Can you? I presume so. I'm going to go ahead and start talking.
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about three major issues. First, I want to talk a little bit about the victory itself, because I think, well, of course, everyone is in the euphoria. I think there are some important characteristics about it. I think, first, to point out that it was national in scope. I think you have to recognize that the critical seats that were won in East Malaysia would not have made the victory for Pakatan possible without them, in Sabah and in Sarawak. I think this is actually an important shift and change. And it was across the board in terms of across all of the country in terms of Malaysia itself. So it is a very national victory, although there were some local factors, particularly in Sabah, that actually changed the dynamic. I would also say that when we look at the change in voting swings, they were quite massive. In some constituencies were traditionally UMNO bases, as much as a 30% swing. So this was something that is unprecedented and also speaks to something that is actually quite different in Malaysia's history. There are two narratives to understand the victory. The one narrative focuses heavily on the role of Mahathir, and of course Najib as a liability, Mahathir as a safe landing, and of course Anwar behind as a reformer, helping to pull the reformer forces together. I think that's a legitimate narrative. I also draw attention in my work to what I see as the narrative of the structural forces that were at play. Importantly here, that this was a tax revolt against the GST. You have to keep in mind that up until the service tax was introduced in 2015, only 2.1 million Malaysians paid taxes. Now all 13 million were expected to. This is something was a big transformation, and there's a history in Malaysia of tax revolts going back until the 19th century. We can see those things playing out, especially on the ground. There was also a big shift within UMNO itself. Najib made the party about him, and the party grassroots revolted. We can see that even in a place like Putrajaya, 50% of the vote was won by opposition forces, of course, Harapan and PAS. And I think this actually speaks to the structural dimensions of things that were happening. And of course, the most important force that I see as a structural dynamic is the force of nationalism, that people came together to save their country. The shaming of Malaysia under the Najib administration had a very big impact on ordinary people. And we see all of these things meld together. It was clear on the ground that the forces were coming together. I underestimated the swing of it, but I definitely identified it. And I think it is the election and victory speaks to the fundamental counter narrative of what we're seeing globally. That it is actually against the forces of the right. It's against the forces of authoritarianism. It speaks to the power of people. These are Asia's story, besides the personal characters involved, is actually so powerful. As Jonathan alluded to, I think the second issue, which I think is equally important, is the electoral turnover. It wasn't just a matter of hours. It was an entire day where there was high levels of insecurity about whether or not the system would give way to the vote that happened. In the first few hours, of course, we know that there was resistance to accepting the results. In the subsequent hours, there was an attempt to try to sway the results with the use of war chests. And even at the last minute, there were efforts to try to kind of bring in alternative forces and play the opposition against itself, to have not Mahathir sworn in, but someone else. This was, interestingly, I think history will show that there were a lot of heroes inside the system, from the Inspector General of Police to the Deputy King at that time, Raja Nazrin, as well as many people beside UMNO who basically said, hey, we have to accept these results. I think financial interests were at the core, because many of the elite recognized that this would not accepting the result would make the situation worse. But Malaysia did not go the route of an emergency system, and it did not go the route of violence by the choices of those elites within the system. And I think this important drive of elites, I think, is going to continue to create momentum, at least in the next few months, where there's a lot of pressure from society, but also within the system to try to make changes and to accept that. So this is a turnover that will continue. But I want to raise my last set of comments to what I see as the impact of what this is going to mean and how we see Malaysia moving forward. First of all, as Jonathan alluded to, Najib is heading to jail. I think that the 1MDB scandal, as well as other issues of corruption and money laundering, will play themselves out. And I think what will be Southeast Asia's first major leader heading to prison for his activities. This in itself will be part of the amazing story of Malaysia's dynamic intellectual behavior. How far the I think is uncertain, but I think it won't just be Najib himself. There will be others who will be caught up in this issue. Now, let's talk about what are the other dynamics. Inside Pakatan Harapan, as a group, there are three major sources of difference, which I think will shape the scope of economic and political reform, which I think has been alluded to and discussed by Jonathan, and I think we can see key steps that it's happening. But I think there are differences not only of personality, which of course are playing out in the negotiation, and of course they involve long-standing problems of personality, personal relationships, antipathies that are not going to be easily completely addressed. And of course, the Barisan Nasional, the forces of opposition will try to capitalize on those. But beyond that, there are differences among how much in the scope of political reform. Some would like things to be much broader than others. There are differences over economic policy. Some people would like a more populist or initiative. Some other people would like a more conservative, a more neoliberal position. We're going to see those differences. And there's differences over social policy, particularly in terms of dealing with the issues of race and religion, which become very sensitive issues even within Pakatan Harapan. So we're going to my point here is to say is that confidence of many people with a lot of hope. I think we have to recognize that the opposition is very disparate, and there are rightly going to be points of cleavages that are going to have to be navigated. How much space Mahathir has to address these and how much he has within the system will be things that I think will be difficult, be hard to move forward in an easy way. It's going to be a bumpy road. Another key thing that shifted is that we see the end of Barisan Nasional. My expectation is that MCA and MIC will close up shop, PBB will become more autonomous, and we will not see a multi-ethnic coalition. But it is not, in contrast to my book in the 2016, the end of UMNO. My sense is that UMNO has now ended because it had been negatively impacted by Najib's takeover of the party. Now is an opportunity for rebirth for that party. But it will have a serious battle inside, what I consider to be old forces versus new forces, the Zahids versus the more younger generation of Khairi, potentially with Hisham. And it will be a decision between old politics, which are racialized politics, versus new politics focusing on issues of governance and trying to clean out some of the systems. It's not going to be easy for that party. I expect it to be much weaker. As a consequence, the people who will be driving the opposition will be the Islamist Party, which did reasonably well winning up 2 state governments in Kelantan and in Terengganu, 18 seats as well. It is becoming highly racialized, and it will, I think, join forces with the more negative and racial dimensions within UMNO. We are going to see race and religion continue to be very focal issues in the political terrain. Of the 9 states that Pakatan Harapan won, at least 3 of them were won by very small margins. We're going to see instability in these state governments, of which race and religion issues play to that in very significant ways. It is a very big challenge of trust building as people move forward. There's a lot of momentum. It is a very new type of politics, but there are also things that are permeating that are going to continue that I've mentioned before. This is just a way of opening up some of the discussions. highlight, however, besides the domestic, see geopolitical shifts. There's going to be a bit of a reckoning with the Singapore-Malaysia relationship. I expect there'll be a lot of reckoning with the China projects, which may be canceled and reviewed. And of course, we're going to see a different role as Malaysia tries to capitalize on this positive energy to promote itself more globally as somewhere that is open for business. Despite the last 4 days of sell-offs in the stock market and some worrisome aspects, I think that there are some steady hands that are looking towards the future, in economic future. So it's going to be a different relationship with the international system as well.
Great, many thanks. Can you hear us quite clearly or not?
I can do perfectly now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's got a little better because Jonathan's been having problems hearing us. So look, we're going to come into the clubhouse and move to Matt Hayes, who's been having a look at the interactions of political parties. So maybe you can bring us up to date on that.
Sure. Thanks, Dominic. You have to excuse me, I was a last-minute substitution here, so if my thoughts are a bit all over the place, forgive me. Just want to echo what was kind of said, the historic nature of this election. Going into it, myself included, nobody thought the opposition would win. And looking at polling data beforehand, the top two issues that people were concerned about, this was a poll taken in April, were inflation and issues of corruption. So you think that would bode poorly for UMNO, but at the same time, 70% of Malay Muslim voters thought that UMNO and the incumbent government were better equipped to handle the economy. Along with that, only 33% thought Pakistans gave them confidence, in their ability to handle the economy. Along with that, you have gerrymandered districts, which Jonathan talked about. You have not only gerrymandered districts, but districts, so in the rural area where UMNO's stronghold, those districts are much smaller population sets, but equal number of representatives in parliament compared to the urban ones where Pakistan's base of support is. So UMNO going into this should have won hands down. And I think you saw the shift, and I'm sure Jonathan and Bridget could talk to this being on the ground beforehand. Days beforehand, Mahathir and the opposition leadership had huge crowds, huge support on their side. And as Bridget said, this was really an election on the economics. Malaysia's economy was one of the fastest growing in Southeast Asia. I think it grew at 5.5% last year. But at the same time, that wasn't trickling down. The cost of goods and services were going up, and people's paychecks were not catching up with that. So it was really a referendum on UMNO's handling of the economy after all those years. And the question, that I have is, what happens in the post-Mahathir landscape? As Bridget alluded to, for 60-plus years, Malaysia has been ruled by one coalition and one party that has dominated that. Now you have four parties who don't agree on things like the economy, healthcare, education, taxes, social policy, what have you. So after Mahathir exits and Anwar comes in, can he lead these four parties forward and make all these reforms that the population is looking for? Anwar rules PKR, which is now the largest party, through his cult of personality. Can he do that with all these partners as well? So that's kind of my main question as well. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Good, short and sweet. Of course, a major issue in Malaysia has been human rights for a very long time, and that's something that Phil Robertson of Human Rights Watch has taken special interest. So I think that's going to be the focus of your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dominic. For those who have gotten used to a Malaysia that seemed frozen in political time, I mean, that was what we were looking at going into this election, where we all thought, again, like Matthew was saying, that it was going to be more of the same. A Barisan Nasional government returned perhaps with a smaller margin, but still in power. It's been an incredible 8 days. I mean, it's really a political earthquake, a 9 on the Richter scale. And in fact, I've sort of run out of superlatives to describe what is going on. And as someone who, has been fighting human rights battles in Malaysia for years, seeing the photo of Mahathir shaking the hand of the newly pardoned Anwar Ibrahim is nothing short of surreal. It's beyond almost any imagining I could have had. And it took me back to a conversation I had in KL. I was sitting and talking with Ambiga Srinivasan and Cynthia Gabriel. This was a couple years ago, and they had actually, after Dr. M. Mahathir had broken with Najib and UMNO and left, he had called them up and asked them to come see him. And, you know, invited them to talk and talked about, you know, perhaps some sort of larger alliance against Najib and the BN. And, you know, they were still trying to wrap, when we were talking, they were still trying to wrap their ideas, their minds around the idea of like an alliance with a person who had led the crackdown on dissidents in the 1987 Operation Lalang, you know, which was, many of their friends actually had gone to prison in that event, and, you know, had stage managed the first sodomy trial of Anwar. And they swore me to secrecy in part because they knew that as soon as the information came out, they'd start being attacked by their other friends in civil society for even considering this possibility. So they asked me a little bit of like, what would my advice be? And there was almost like a Game of Thrones type dynamic to it. You know, it boiled down to really sort of the adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And given the desperate times, the fact that dozens of activists at the time were facing sedition charges and other charges, it seemed like desperate tactics were required. And so they decided to push forward. You know, the issue, however, that we really talked about was first and foremost about trust, whether they could trust Mahathir after all the things that had happened previously. Could they trust him to undertake, you know, reforms to, you know, respect human rights, to deal with the electoral system in a fair way, you know, to push anti-corruption, press freedom, other sorts of reforms that they felt that Malaysia urgently required. And you know, now I think, and over the next few months, it's time that that trust is going to be tested. This is going to be the issue that we're looking at. You know, Mahathir is saying that he's going to be prime minister for a year or two, and then he's going to hand over to Anwar Ibrahim. And you know, while we're talking about all the radical changes in the different atmosphere and the possible prosecution of Najib over 1MDB, you know, the question is really, what is going to change? What is actually promised? What, in fact, you know, beyond the sort of fact that we're going to see probably Prime Minister Najib and the 1MDB investigation motor ahead, and Najib probably end up in prison because he was so careless. I mean, you know, transferring money directly into his own bank account. You know, I think that the question is for us, you know, as a human rights organization, what is actually going to be delivered? And everybody's talking about how different the various the parties are in the Pakatan Harapan coalition, but they actually already agreed on a party platform. And so, you know, as a group that tries to hold governments, you know, accountable for what they say, you know, we of course are delving into that actual very long, you know, over 130-page platform. And what is in there, if it's actually implemented, is absolutely revolutionary. In fact, you know, if it's faithfully implemented, I would say the things that they're talking about would jumpstart a human rights and good governance revolution in Malaysia. And so, you know, I'll reference this, talk a little about what they're talking about, and then also reference it compared to some of our reports. Since we're sitting in a press club, one of the things they're talking about is media freedom. You know, that they're going to review all the laws and regulations related to the media. They're going to guarantee media freedom. They're going to increase the independence of Bernama and Radio Television Malaysia, which are the government-controlled press. They're talking about establishing a media council to handle complaints about the media and develop a code of ethics, moving towards self-regulation for the media. They're talking about abolishing a number of rights-abusing laws, laws that, in fact, we put out this report a while back, creating a culture of fear. If they go through what they're saying they're doing, I could probably just toss this report away because, you know, many of the things that we documented where people were being prosecuted were for the Sedition Act, Prevention of Crime Act, Universities and University Colleges Act, which was suppressing rights of students to be involved in politics, Printing, Presses, and Publications Act, dealing with the whole issue of censorship and control of the printed media. The National Security Act, of course, which is a very broad law. And we would see all of a sudden all these dozens of sedition cases against various activists simply be dropped. They're talking about reforming other rights-abusing provisions of laws, like the Penal Code, the Communications and Multimedia Act, which is one which has been used to control online media, Prevention of Terrorism Act, the Security Offenses Act, both which have provisions that prevent judicial review of decisions by the government. These are things are all being looked at as part of that core document that the four parties agreed to. They're also talking about Whistleblower Protection Act, and revising the Official Secrets Act, revising Witness Protection Act. They're talking about implementing a Freedom of Information Act in those demands, and providing financial provisions to make it happen. So this is revolutionary. We're talking about the kind of change in terms of human rights that would be something that would be completely new for the region. It would be something actually we expected to happen after another recent election in another neighboring country, namely Myanmar, but obviously that hasn't happened. They're talking about separating the roles of the Attorney General. The Attorney General in Malaysia is both the legal advisor to the government, but he's also the chief public prosecutor. And part of the problem has been that the Attorney General has taken a number of decisions over the years that seem to very clearly favor the government. So they're talking about creating a new process for nominating Attorney General. The Attorney General would be, on one hand, would be a member of the Parliament and would be a member of the Cabinet and provide the legal advice to the government, but then there would be another process for appointing an independent individual as the actual chief prosecutor. Fascinating as well, and this was something that I was really astonished when I figured it out a number of years ago, was the actual Parliament of the BN, with the exception of the Budget Committee and I think a Personnel Committee, really had no real standing committees, meaning that there was no real effective oversight by the Parliament of any of these line ministries. Now they're talking about fundamental reform of the Parliament. Things like having standing committees where those committees would have the power to require a minister to appear and give testimony. A public accounts committee that they said that would be chaired by an opposition MP. Forcing the House Speaker and the Senate President to resign from political parties when they take up the position so that you have impartial administration of the Parliament. Ideas like having a white paper appear before you actually table a piece of legislation. I mean, over the years, we have spent times, every time the Parliament of Malaysia was going to sit for a session, we all would have to brainstorm about the worst possible things they could do, because we would get no notice for a rights-abusing piece of legislation that was coming forward. They're even talking about having Prime Minister's questions for 30 minutes every week. So, a fundamental reform that would really change the dynamic between the government and the Parliament. Importantly also, they're talking about taking away from the Prime Minister the power of appointment to the National Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission of Malaysia, the Judicial Appointments Commission, and the Myanmar Anti-Corruption Commission, to have those instead appointed by the Parliament. If these things happen, this is going to be a fundamental reform, a fundamental rights-respecting reform that we would expect would, I think, make Malaysia much different from many of the other countries that we deal with in ASEAN. There's more than that, too. I mean, the Election Commission, they're talking about having a caretaker government guidelines, where the idea would be that there would be some process so that when a government, and the next government goes to elections, they're not in charge during the period of time of the elections. Cleaning up voting rolls, better postal voting, the list goes on and on and on. And, of course, these things were all agreed by a alliance of parties at a time when they were trying to appeal for votes and not expecting to win. Now they've won. What are they going to do? Right? This is the big issue. What changes will be implemented? What reforms will be pushed through and what ones will be left aside? The actual list of I mean, the reading of this platform is fascinating. And then I think, like most people, you don't read the platform of the political party until actually after something happens. As we're going through this, we're like, this is great. Oh my God, we've wanted this for years. Maybe we could get this done. But what is it going to actually happen? Mahathir has promised real rule of law and exceptions for no one. This is what he's been quoted as saying. But how far is that really going to go? We were a bit dismayed when we saw that Mahathir recently met with the current governor and the former chief minister of Sarawak, Abdul Taib Mahmud, whose rule in Sarawak is synonymous with corruption and deforestation. Will he be investigated? Will he be held accountable for what he has done? Good question. On the issue of corruption, there's talking about setting up these royal commissions for the various different troubled government agencies, 1MDB, Felda, Mara, Tabjung Haji, all these various different elements that have had governance problems in a very significant way. What's going to be done here? Where does reform go to, and where is it met with resistance? One of the things that we have been continually pushing on is the issue of the lack of accountability by the police in Malaysia. And we did a report a number of years ago called No Answers, No Apology, because we had documented that ordinary people by the Malaysian police were being killed at probably 15 to 30 people were dying in police custody every year, basically being tortured to death. And probably about the same number dying from mysterious police shootings, either excessive use of violence or extrajudicial killings, the sort of shot while trying to escape narrative. These were ordinary people. These were not political activists. These were people, for some reason or another, came up in the attention of the police. Either they had done something or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there was no apologies. There were no answers. There was nothing provided except cover up, cover up, cover up. And, will there be a change in the way that the police are regulated and controlled by the political parties? Will there be an independent police complaints and misconduct commission, which was recommended years ago by a royal commission but never implemented because the police were against it? These are the sort of things where we're looking at now that will Malaysia change in a fundamental way? And I think the jury is still out about that. I mean, the only reform that we know that probably will not happen was the subject of our third report, which was on LGBT rights. Thank you.
Might just be wrong about that, Phil. Bridget, can you hear us clearly? Because Jonathan has actually dropped out. He can only hear about 30%, but can you hear us clearly?
I can see him I can hear it very
clearly. Okay, that's excellent.
I have a quick response to Phil, and that is we have to look at these manifestos as a sort of, as we look at trade deals in Southeast Asia. They are broad goals, but not necessarily commitments. I think that while the things are very important, and but I think there's a lot of things in there that were part of the more idealistic members of Harapan. I think they're going to definitely be compromises made, and some of these things are going to get more traction than others. The scope of reform is something within Harapan that will be there are differences, and I think one of the things I was talking about just a moment ago was the issue of resistance, and I pointed to the importance of race and religion. But I have to point out that 35% of the seats are controlled by UMNO and BN. 30.6% of the public voted for UMNO, and about 50% voted for the opposition in some form. So we can look at the victory and we can acknowledge that, and I do think, in fairness, there is genuine effort to implement some of these initiatives. But I also do not underestimate the importance of the resistance that exists within the system, and I think that one has to also be conscious that this victory is not as strong as they need to make some of these reforms. For example, they don't have the 2/3 that's necessary for a lot of the constitutional changes that are for Parliament. and they don't have 2/3 in the parliaments. They don't have enough of this constitutional shifts. I think, well, Phil is quite right to identify those areas and to point to how they can be such broadly in scope and to qualify them. I also think the real challenges that they face from the system itself are going to be significant. From the police force, for example, from part of civil service, and all of these problems, corruption, for example, it's a systemic problem that goes down to the very core. It's not just arresting Najib. It's everyone practices this almost in Malaysia, including the business people. So changing these norms and changing these practices are going to take much more significance and much more significant measures and much more significant political will. And I personally, while I understand the hesitation about Mahathir given his history, having watched him on the campaign and followed him and listened to him speak on a number of closed-door forums as the campaign approached, I think there is a sense that he's a man in a hurry, and he does have a clear sense of some of the priorities he would like to make. I mean, the fact that he chose the education ministry speaks to something that I think is going to be very fascinating. I think, for example, we're going to see the return to English-educated curriculum in some sections, and we're going to see some shifts in religious education. I think that are things that he himself has a lot of potential to be able to introduce those. But I'm also very sanguine about the scope of rights that can be made in the human rights areas, particularly involving corruption, involving the illegal economy, involving some of the government agencies, involving the cases involving people like Pastor Coe and others, and Kevin Moraes, people who were murdered or disappeared, that actually I think are part of the story of the Najib government that are very problematic. So there's going to be limits, and these lines are going to be tested.
Good. Right. We have in the clubhouse a microphone, so if people want to ask questions, they can line up. Please be very, very short and speak very clearly and slowly directly into the microphone. So we have one coming up.
Chris Bruton, a member of the club. Could we ask a little bit about the wider implications? A lot of people in Thailand are not so much interested in Malaysia, but they are very interested in Thailand and the Indochina region. Obviously, we've seen some big changes in the world in general, and Malaysia is just the latest. But is this going to have some impact on Thailand? Is it going to have some impact on Cambodia, which will be the next election coming up? I mean, is this going to happen? I'm thinking that I just heard about the police in Malaysia, but not about the army. The Prime Minister never really controlled the army in Malaysia, but he certainly does in Thailand, and so do they in Cambodia and Singapore and so on. So maybe that would have a difference. Maybe there could be just a coup if the election goes in the wrong direction. But what are the broader implications of the Malaysian result in terms of the rest of UMNO, of ASEAN?
Right, Matthew, that's your bailiwick, so off you go.
I would say the short answer is no. It's not going to have an effect in places like Thailand or Cambodia. The thing with Malaysia is that, you know, though the system was set up so the PH could not win, there was a viable opposition. And that opposition was talking about issues that people were concerned about, such as the economy and corruption. Here in Thailand, there is no opposition. In Cambodia, Hun Sen has shut out that opposition. So without a viable alternative that's legally allowed to campaign and voice their opposition, I think it's kind of slim hopes for the wider region.
Yeah, I think it will certainly be encouraging to various different elements of civil society. You know, the fact that, you know, this big upset took place in Malaysia. The Malaysian NGOs play a leading role in ASEAN civil society networks, so there will be a lot of discussion about this. I'm sure that on the sidelines of the big ASEAN meeting in Singapore later this year, people will be talking about this. But the actual, I mean, I think these different countries have remarkably insulated themselves from these sort of cross-border trends. You know, Thailand is its own dynamic. You have a very politicized army that is still continuing control. Whereas in Malaysia, of course, the army has never come out of the barracks. It's never been involved in a military coup, and it's very non-political in the broad sense. And in Cambodia, you know, the army is essentially an extension of the ruling party. So, you know, the issue in Cambodia, of course, with Hun Sen is that anybody who stands up is going to get knocked down. You know, as Hun Sen has said previously, you know, if you challenge him, he's going to lock the door and beat the dog. You know, that was exactly what he said, and that's exactly what people are afraid of. That's why so many of these Cambodian opposition people have fled to Thailand to try to seek some sort of degree of protection, because they know that the army, the police, the courts are all in Hun Sen's back pocket. So I think it will certainly unsettle some of the authoritarians in the region, but it will probably not result in any direct impact beyond a raising of hopes, I think, that, you know, change is possible.
Bridget, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I respectfully disagree with both the speakers, but let me just let me give you my sense. First of all, I think that Malaysia's position within ASEAN is going to shift, given on issues of the Spratlys and the South China Sea. I think that Najib was seen as accommodating China. So within ASEAN, I think we're going to see some kind of a return to more of a hardening and divisions within the organization. So that's kind of speaking about ASEAN as an organization itself. I think the second side of this is what we see in the implication on the Indochina side, but also I think we can talk about more broadly the Malaysia's symbolism. While I agree with Matthew that the organizational dimension is quite important for the opposition, and we see very weak opposition both in Thailand and in the context of Cambodia, given the pressures that they're facing. And we also, I would agree with Phil that there is an inspirational effect. I think we cannot underestimate the importance of surprise. And the lessons of people vis-a-vis not so much the issues of opposition, but the structural effects on what's happening in these economies, and the group younger people. I mean, Cambodia in 2013, effectively the opposition won that election. Cambodia has followed a lot of the same game plan that Malaysia has to stay in office, although applied many of those things in a much more, I would say, crude manner. But I think that the power to the people impact is something that I think cannot be fully underestimated given the circumstances. Will those effects be short-term seen? Maybe not, and you guys, both of you might be right. But will they be longer term? Yes, I think that they have the potential to germinate that. The place that I'm looking more carefully on the regional effect is what this will have the impact on Singapore, where there is a lot of political uncertainty over leadership and others. And I also see this having ripple effects more globally in the Muslim world, given the fact that Malaysia stands out for a very different type of example. And of course, this has spillovers also regional neighbors in Indonesia. So I'm a little bit more cautiously optimistic about some of this, and I also see some of these shifts as quite fundamental that will have more policy impact as well.
Right, question.
Danny Spate, a member. Two short questions. Was the misleading polling missing a generational divide that we've seen in other elections around the world? The second question Bridget already mentioned was, if there was one ASEAN country that could be affected by this result, would it be Singapore? Would we see some change in the authoritarian government that's been running Singapore since the beginning? Thank you.
Right, well, Bridget, you brought up Singapore. Can you just elaborate a little bit more about the impact that if you think there's anything to add?
Well, we just spent 2 hours at the University of Sydney discussing this, and a lot of questions about what's happening in contemporary Singapore. But I think there are high levels of insecurity over the economy, over the leadership succession, over the future, Lee Hsien Loong himself. I think the Singapore relationship is going to face a reconfiguring. Lee Hsien Loong bet a lot on the Najib horse. And this election is being perceived and widely discussed in Singapore, more so I think than in the rest of the region, given the close ties. So I think that, and there's always been a kind of effect. I mean, I slightly disagree. I think that we do see interregional influences. What happens in the mayoral contest, for example, in Jakarta impacts Malaysian tactics, and similarly, Malaysia and Singapore elections have had a definite effect on each other. So I see this as something that's going to help to reinforce some of the swing against the PAP that I think I'm expecting in the next election. But I also agree with Matthew's main point, is that a lot of it depends on being able to organize. I mean, there are very important lessons for this election in Malaysia, that, you know, if you organize, you can bring about change, but you have to be more strategic, and it takes time. And I think the opposition in Singapore is not quite at that point, but it can change. And I think one of the things that potentially can be a shift is if there are people inside the system, like with Mahathir, shift back to the opposition in Singapore, you're going to have a game changer there also. Whether or not that happens is too early to say, but I think these are very important trajectories and lessons that are going to play out. Now to the issue of polling, I think this is something I follow and carry out myself, so I discussed at length with many of the groups, Merdeka Center and Invoke and others who were carrying out the election. Many of them, I think they were wrong. I called, for example, how important PAS would be in the final result, in part because I think the polling mechanisms don't capture a lot of the sentiment on the ground. A lot of the change happened during the campaign itself. And a lot of people, especially in the system, just did not give the answer, that they didn't tell the truth. So because of fear and because of cautiousness. So I think polling can give us certain parameters, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not a dynamic mechanism to see those differences. And even studies on social media don't necessarily capture the areas where they're still isolated for some of that, and not as active. This campaign, in some ways, is quite interesting because, you know, if, for example, our studies of internet show us that social media forces are kind of being anti-democratic, and that the resources can control the bots and others. This campaign in Malaysia is an alternative story. I mean, you know, Cambridge Analytica did operate in Malaysia, but it didn't impact the results. In fact, we saw social media actually serving a kind of more democratic force. It was almost like a similar dynamic that happened in the Philippines, is that the viralness of messaging that was sent by ordinary people was very powerful in this campaign in the Malaysia side. So what I'm trying to say to you is that polling and doesn't capture some of these things that happen in the campaign itself, and we actually see kind of a lot of counter currents in the Malaysia example to some of what we're projecting for trends elsewhere.
And Cambridge Analytica, of course, was big in Thailand a long time ago.
Yes.
Cut its teeth here. Maybe we should go back to astrology. But anyway, do you have any comments on flawed polling, Matt?
Well, I certainly hope that actually there will be a knock-on effect in Singapore. I mean, I think there is the same degree of tiredness with the ruling government. You know, now that the primary figure, Lee Kuan Yew, has passed from the scene, no one has really stepped up to replace him with the degree of support of the Singapore people that you would expect. It would be very interesting to see significant gains for the opposition in Singapore. But at this point, the opposition is still quite weak. There isn't a sort of unifying figure. I mean, people forget that on one hand, Mahathir, I think, was seen by many people in Malaysia as a steady pair of hands that you could then pass the baton to. People realized that at age 92, he's only going to be around for 1 or 2 years, so they were, in fact, voting for the opposition. But, this was someone who was tried and tested. This is someone who was remembered as a prime minister who was hands-on and presided over a period of time in Malaysia when the economy grew at tremendous rates. and who also kept the country essentially safe during the period of the financial crisis, the 1998 financial crisis, that sank many of the other economies in the region. So people were, looking at Mahathir, and they're also looking at Anwar, and they said, this person, these people have experience. It's hard to see someone in the Singapore opposition that has that same sort of experience and gravitas that would be able to inspire confidence to move over. But we keep hoping that there might be some change, precisely because the issue of human rights in Singapore is very prominent at this time, and it's a very big issue where many of the youth in Singapore, I think, are tired of the kind of restrictions that they're expected to put up with without a clear reason. I mean, the days of Singapore as being the unsettled entrepot, where the all sorts of things were going on, I think is really past. I mean, it's a modern economy, and it's a place where, in fact, I think the politics have really lagged behind the economy.
I would just say real quickly, I think the gentleman brought up a good point for the youth vote. I think it's 40% of Malaysians are under 40. And the polling had showed that the youth vote was going to drop off because a lot of the young people I talked to were a bit apathetic about politics. But as Phil alluded to, Mahathir is this grandfatherly figure. So all these young people were attracted to him. They heard all the good stories. KLCC was a racetrack up until the 1980s. Downtown Malaya, KL is really Mahathir's baby. And these kids coming of age who are 25, 30 have no recollection of what it was like when Mahathir was prime minister in the 80s. So they just hear all these good things and they were attracted to him. The other thing is, too, the incumbent, no one wants to be like their parents. I mean, Najib, it's not cool to be with BN, even though UMNO had a big youth wing. It's very hierarchical, UMNO. So the young people were not empowered to talk about issues and talk to younger people on the ground. So I think UMNO did a disservice by not reaching out to a lot of young people.
Right, question.
My name is Buzz Singer. I'm a member of the club. Where does Mahathir all of a sudden get these credentials as a Democrat? To me, from what I know about him, which, believe me, is not that much, many of the policies that are now part of the manifesto of the coalition were policies that, in fact, were initiated and supported while Mahathir was in control of the party and of the country. So it seems to me that he's being asked to now lead a change, not of something that happened while he was off in the forest someplace, but of things that happened under his aegis. So I guess I'm asking, is this a real transformation? And where does the, or is it a repackaging?
Right, did you hear that, Bridget?
I did. You want me to go first?
Yeah, I would think you'd have some strong ideas on that. Please do, yes.
Okay, well, I think, look, at one level, I think that when you compare Mahathir within the system now to other people in Harapan, we can already see that he is a much more cautious and more resistant to some of the reforms than they would like. This, for example, played out in how the response to the anti-fake news bill, where Mahathir said he would review it, others were saying they should repeal it. This is what the point I was raising earlier, is that I think there are differences in the system itself on the pace and the scope of issues of reform. A second point is that I do, at this particular juncture, do think that Mahathir has come to terms with recognizing that his legacy had put in place very serious problems. Now, not everybody sees those problems the same way as he might. I think, for example, that the two-term limit on the issue of the prime ministership, which of course we can see is extraordinarily ironic for a man who was there for 5 terms, it came from Mahathir himself. It didn't come from anybody else. I think that there are some aspects of reform that are coming from him, which I think are valuable. And like Phil, I myself would like to see the proof in the pudding and how they're carried out and implemented, and whether or not they're implemented. I mean, looking at the first week, I think one has to give credit that there have been some very positive signs. These committees that have been set up are substantive. Anwar has been released. There's been moving on the issue of the rule of law. And these are big shifts in a week. I think one has to acknowledge those. I can understand and empathize with your concerns about this as being a repackaging. It could be, as many people at UMNO describe the situation. They says, no, Bridget, it's all about Mahathir's power play, and don't believe him. And I think those are, I can understand those thinking, and I don't completely dismiss it, as we should all, as people looking at this place with the kind of, from different lenses, have to keep in mind. But I am also giving credit where credit has been due so far. And given what we've seen and given the focal point, my own view remains that at 92 he could be doing something else. He's chosen to come back, and I think there is a seriousness to that. It is a sense of this was extraordinarily impactful for ordinary people, the sense of sacrifice and coming back, and I think, you know, while I wait to see whether or not how much traction it has, and I'm, to be frank with you, not too optimistic in some of the areas of corruption and cronyism, which I think are problematic, and some of the areas that Phil outlined in terms of some of the scopes of human rights involving the police and others, which are very difficult issues to get at in any type of system, including those that are more open and more democratic anyway. I think that I'm going to give credit. I'm going to be more open and suggest and come on the side of where I think there is some substance here, and I can, you know, the public pressure for this drive is quite strong. The palpable nature of that Malaysia. I mean, Malaysians feel freer than they have felt in their whole, for many of them, in their whole lives. It's a really, you know, historic type of moment that you could see and how people were carrying out themselves. And that in itself gives tremendous opportunity for these leaders to be able to do some of the changes. And even if they are able to get shortly down the list, they've distinguished themselves from many of the other countries in the region in this regard. Myanmar being a good example that Phil mentioned, but I think there are others that we could talk about that are even Indonesia. And keep in mind that the reform process in Indonesia and democratic consolidation that we've seen, and it's very uneven and big steps back, because, you know, it's been a process that has happened over 20 years. So it's not going to be a slow process. Mahathir is in a unique position that he's not beholden to anyone at this particular juncture. He's not coming back into power. He's got his time to leave and to redefine his legacy. Whether or not it will be a legacy that all reformers want, I think they're probably not going to get that. But will it be something that's very different than the Mahathir before? I think that's the case. Almost likely will be the case.
Bridget, whilst we're on this, Phil brought up this whole issue of the false dawn in Burma, you know, the disappointment that everybody's had with the elected government there. That one of the aspects of this new government is it's very young, it's very inexperienced. Mahathir is the most experienced person. He is the key factor. How imperious do you think he's going to be in running his cabinet? And how do you think, you know, how will he manage the cabinet? How will he delegate when he has a limited number of people who are competent?
Well, I think think there are more competent people than people acknowledge. I mean, that the Pakatan Harapan has served in 2 state governments, and keep in mind, person to person, if you compare the opposition credentials or Harapan credentials now with former UMNO credentials, there's a lot more talent and education in the Harapan side than there was on many of the UMNO side. I think a lot will depend on how much the civil service works with this new government, and this is where Mahathir can play an important role. But I expect there will be resistance within that. If the more divided UMNO, that means that it gives more space for Mahathir to make some of the changes with his Harapan colleagues, and I expect there will be a lot of pressure placed on Mahathir himself also to make those sets of commitments, and from many of his Harapan colleagues as well. So what I say is that I think that, I expect there will be disappointments pretty quickly. And I think we've already seen that if people go beyond the boundaries of what people's expectations are, so for example, when Rafizi Ramli started to make complaints about the cabinet, you saw this massive public outcry against him. I think the pressures are going to be driven by a lot of what the public is expecting of them. The problem that the government faces is the expectations are very high, as they were in Myanmar, and overly high. And of course, Myanmar's failed miserably in meeting some of those expectations, especially in the areas of human rights, especially in media and others. I think here it will be very much about managing those expectations. One of the areas we saw, I think, that they handled so reasonably well in the first week was to put in this economic council and to kind of give a steady hand. One of the things that happened in the campaign is that the presence of Dime and Rafida in the campaign really moved a lot of people in the business sector who did not feel that Pakatan Harapan was capable of managing the economy, and that with their presence there, it actually was a kind of an important turner for change and motivator for people to shift their loyalties in that context. So I think I see this as something. I do see that there are going to be problematic dimensions. One of the things that the government will face is that they don't know how to keep their problems inside the tent. They like to use it outside in the media and to pressure, and often these differences are very petty and small and personality driven. These are things that are going to take time for them to come to terms with and to build a sense of confidence. And I think there will be lots of disappointments. But I think that there is also a certain degree of patience, given the fact that this is very, very new territory for a country that's not done this before.
Good. Question?
Thank you. Well, the title says tsunami. Why tsunami? Sounds rather pessimistic, isn't it? I mean, the title of this evening's program. Now, if we will have a follow-up program of this sort, whenever it will be, I think I would be very delighted to have an ethnic Malay or Malaysian national in the audience. The last thing, I have a question for Phil. Phil talked about this corruption in Sarawak, didn't you? Right. And Sarawak is down there in a huge island. I do not know how many provinces there are in Malaysia Federation, but why did you have to mention about the corruption in Sarawak, particularly?
Okay, well, the tsunami was the people's vote against the Najib government, just to answer that question. Corruption in Sarawak.
The reason I raised the issue of the corruption in Sarawak is that the individual, the leader, who is most associated with that corruption, just met with Mahathir I think it was on actually a day or two after the election. And so the question immediately came, we're talking about corruption, we're talking about the things that were done by Najib connected to 1MDB, if we're also talking about corruption, shouldn't we also be talking about the corruption of Taib, who, you know, is randomly estimated to be worth as much as 20 billion US dollars. So, I mean, you're talking about a pillar of institutional corruption that, you know, if you talk to anybody who is involved with natural environmental protection, I mean, Taib is pretty much at the top of the list in Asia of people they have a problem with because of the deforestation, because of the exploitation of the natural resources of Sarawak that has resulted in such systematic deforestation. And I mean, if Johnny Miller was here, he could tell the story about going to see some of these clear-cut areas and swimming across rivers with crocodiles and things like that.
Right, well, he's not here. Okay, question, please.
Just can I make a quick comment? I think the speaker is quite right that it's nice to have a Malaysian on the panel. I don't think it necessarily has to be of one ethnic group. That's a little bit of the old politics. But I think it would be good to have a Malaysian come and speak as well.
Let's invite Anwar.
Anwar has been in
he's going to be going around and doing various different academic things and touring around. So yeah, invite Anwar up.
But Anwar has been in the club, and he was very good when he spoke here. It was before his second jailing, obviously. Just to clarify that, we have bent over backwards to find Malaysians to speak, and the people who are in Kuala Lumpur at the moment are obviously very preoccupied with other things and difficult to get hold of. And we have discovered that in Bangkok there is a very, very limited number of people with a good working knowledge of Malaysian politics and the situation there. So our choices are very limited. Just to clarify that. Question.
Hi. So I'm a journalist based in Singapore. My wife is involved in civil activism there. And right now there's quite an explosion of activity about the Malaysian elections. There's a lot of hope going on there. And a lot of the activists are talking about how basically Malaysia got it right, you know, has done very well. A lot of people are talking about moving out there right now. In fact, my wife, Kirsten Han, she was at the select committee meeting, Phil, and the one that Human Rights Watch was called out for.
Yes.
And so we've seen very recently the sort of attacks that happened to civil activists in Singapore. There is a lot of hope based on Malaysia right now. And I was wondering, what do you think is realistic between the sort of discourse that's going to go on between the new government and NGOs and civil activism groups and free speech groups like Reporters Without Borders? What would you say is plausible in the near future to try and build a trust and build a relationship between those groups? Because that's going to have knock-on effects too.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, having worked on Singapore issues for many years, what we have seen is a civil society movement that has been hampered and handicapped at every step of the way by a government that is very detail-oriented. I mean, it's essentially ruling a city-state and has been very, very controlling. You know, many of the people who have raised issues or raised concerns, you know, either face direct prosecution directly, or they have their organizations, whether it be an NGO or whether it also be sort of for an online media, put into a hostile regulatory scheme that is designed to tear them down and make it impossible for them to operate. You know, Singapore has been very adept at suppressing activism amongst local people to the extent that, you know, it was always, you talk to Singaporeans at meetings in Malaysia, and they'd be there in Malaysia, and they would be acting like this was a real breath of fresh air that they were in Malaysia. So, I mean, I understand why there is a great deal of excitement, I think, amongst reformers in Singapore. I would say that the problem is what we have seen in Malaysia in terms of efforts to try to control the election process, to gerrymander, to really sort of influence the election process so an opposition party win was impossible in Malaysia. I mean, it's much more intense in Singapore. I think Singapore you know, has never really been seriously challenged. We didn't have, for instance, what we saw 5 years ago in Malaysia, where you had the opposition alliance win a majority of the votes, although coming far short because of the gerrymander and other things like that. I mean, you needed a kind of landslide of this sort to come up with a result where the opposition was able to take power. I just think that the hurdles in Singapore are higher simply because the government is dealing in a much smaller pond, and it's able to control things in a much more intense way. You know, it is able to surveil people. You know, I know, you know, if I go, for instance, to Singapore for this this North Korea summit with Trump, you know, which I probably will do, I'm sure that I'm going to be followed everywhere I go. Just because, you know, Human Rights Watch in Singapore, you know, they don't like us at all. You know, this classic thing, I mean, and the sort of games they play. I mean, this select committee. You know, the select committee, you know, we were having a discussion with them about arranging a time, you know, to have someone go speak there. But it became very clear after a very short period of time that this was just a setup. And it was a setup for them to attack us. You know, they were attacking us on a report that we'd put out, you know, a couple months before, where we had asked them questions. We'd sent a letter to the government saying, we want your views. We'll incorporate your views in our report. Please, you know, give us your views. They didn't respond to our letters, but they wanted to play a game in front of the TV cameras. And so we said, look, you know what? We're not available. Sorry.
Good. Julian.
Malaysia is about 69% Malay Muslim. Over 80% of the electorate voted in the last election. What does this say about the future of race and religion in Malaysia?
Bridget, did you hear that?
Yes, well, I think, first of all, I think anybody who follows Malaysia must understand that the Malay community and the Muslim community is very diverse among itself. It cannot be pigeonholed as it's one set of group or others. A large section of those that voted for Pakatan Harapan consider themselves Malaysian first. They put their Malaysian identity over the other forms of identity, and there's a kind of a coexistence. I think that Mahathir worked hard in framing the election as a Malay tsunami. They played the ethnic card as well. So I think that and it's likely that one of those areas where I mentioned in terms of social policy that's going to be a form of contention is going to be about the potential reintroduction of a new ethnicized policies to address these issues of the community. So I think there are, my sense is that these things still play very large roles, but there's also a lot of diversity within the Muslim community itself. My belief, as I was implying in my earlier remarks, is that the opposition will begin to use the race and religion card because they think that this is something that they can use to undermine the government. And the government doesn't have a clear narrative given the differences itself has over issues like Islamic law, over issues of Bumiputra policies. And I think that while a lot of people are immediately afterwards spoke about this being, you know, an embrace of multi-ethnic narrative and others, I think, well, there's a certain element of substance to that. I think we cannot fool ourselves that the politics of division run very deep, and the forces of conservative identity that were being played on and will continue to be played on. And that it's not just about ethnic identity; it's also the religious conservatism, and that's a lot of where the resistance is already starting to come. We can see this even in the first week, and how they talk about a Chinese minister, or a Malaysian Chinese minister, and the issues of one of the reasons why the cabinet has not announced yet the department who's going to head religious affairs. This is going to be an extraordinarily controversial appointment, of which I think there's going to be a lot of people watching and as a test for the government. Also, in terms of the issues of potential defection, people coming over to Pakatan Harapan, you know, people are saying that there's not enough Malays in the cabinet, Malays in Mahathir's in Harapan as a whole. these things are still very much part of the narrative and are not likely to go away soon. The only benefit that the Pakatan Harapan has is that the national sentiment is still very, very strong. And in fact, the global response to Malaysia's elections has really instilled a lot of national pride. It's kind of reinforced a lot of the euphoria that we see on the ground. But I see Malay issues and Malay issues vis-a-vis within themselves and vis-a-vis the relationship with other communities is quite important as we move forward.
Nothing to add?
You go first.
Yeah. I would just say on the issue of the Malays coming out to support the opposition is really on economic issues, I think. As I mentioned earlier, inflation was through the roof, the cost of products was going up, and people's salaries were not catching up. And I think they saw somebody like Mahathir, who really set up these affirmative action laws too and carried them out in the 80s, that, oh, here's a guy we could trust who could protect our interests while also improving the economy.
Can I speak to this for a moment? And one of the points I forgot to mention is that I think the test for the next government will not necessarily be in the area of the political reforms, but if they can manage the economy well, this will give them more space to do this. It is very much driven by the economic realities.
Yeah, I would say that. I agree with Bridget that unfortunately I think that the newly minted opposition will use these wedge issues of race and religion to try to undermine the government. They're going to try to hit the weak spots. And at that, that is where Mahathir and Anwar are going to be really critical. People, I think, underestimate Anwar's ability, prior to his second arrest and imprisonment. He was the person that was really holding together a very disparate coalition that included PAS, for the 2013 election. He was really the linchpin. He was the person that could talk out these issues with all different parties and sort out some sort of compromise. I think he's going to ultimately be sort of tasked to do the same thing again, even before he takes some sort of formal political role. He's going to have to be the person behind the scenes that is going to be troubleshooting these problems, that is going to be dealing with these concerns, the person that the people are going to go to, whether they're in DAP and unhappy with something, or if they're in Amana unhappy with something, they're going to be going to him saying, we need to sort this out. And how he does that, how capable he is now after, coming out of prison a second time, with, I think more physically diminished than he was previously, that's going to be an issue that we have to look at. And that's just the dynamics that's going to exist there. The only hope I really have for these kind of things diminishing is the sort of broader trend amongst youth around the world to look beyond these sort of things, to look beyond these sort of differences. What we've seen in polling in places, whether it be in the United States or other places, is that the youth are less focused on these kind of identifications than older generations. And I don't know whether that holds for the Malaysian youth. I think that would actually be a very interesting study to engage in. But that's where I would place some hope that somehow we can get beyond these race and religion politics that have dominated Malaysia for so many years.
Right, question?
My name's Simon, I'm a member here. Just one question. This morning, Mahathir mentioned immigration. I'm just wondering, is that a populist type of trigger that he's trying to pull there?
What, he was talking about restricting immigration, was he? Yes. Yeah. Did he relate it to the AEC, the ASEAN opening up? Or?
No, I was just wondering what the nature of
Does anybody know?
Was in Malaysia.
Bridget, do you know anything about immigration?
I think that, I'm smiling because like Phil and others here and other people in the room, I'm sure there's a tremendous amount of irony in that Mahathir was the one who brought in all the migrants into Sabah. But I think that, there is a very large population of migrants from Bangladesh in particular, but from other communities. And it's changing the social fabric of the country. And there is some resistance to that, not quite to the same degree that we do see in Singapore, where it's really strained resources and others. But this is, Malaysia is not quite the kind of ethnic configuration that was described, a 65, a 25, and an 11% type of relationship between India and Malays and between Indians, Chinese, and Malays. It's actually much more complex now, given the amount of migrants that have come into the country. And Najib encouraged a lot of that. Many of them now could vote and somehow got citizenship very quickly. And I think that that is a part, and the political side of it. Another part of it is that there's a recognition that the migrant population keeps down wages. And this is actually a real problem for Malaysia in the middle income trap. And I think there's a discussion, a quite substantive discussion, of reconfiguring the larger economic policies of where migrants play a role, what type of role that they play in terms of cheap labor and the role that foreign labor plays in the economy. I think that these two things go together. In a kind of revamping and rethinking what sort of economic policies that the country moves forward with. There is a recognition among many quarters that Malaysia's over-reliance on foreign labor is actually not necessarily helping to address some of the income inequalities and moving the economy out of the middle income trap.
Right, well, we're moving towards the end. One question I'd like just to get in is if you look back in ASEAN at when things go wrong for political figures, you could say, Suharto was taken down by the economic crisis, but he was allowed to live out his years with dignity in Indonesia, and Marcos was allowed to go into exile in '86, and Thaksin went into exile in 2008, and Yingluck went into exile in 2017. And if anybody thinks that the authorities didn't cooperate in that, they've missed the story. So my question really is, something new is happening in Malaysia. And Jonathan mentioned the exposure yesterday of the loot in Najib's property. I mean, just haystacks of money and jewels, and just beyond belief. It was an Aladdin's cave. So my question to the panel is how hard is Najib going to go down, and what might that mean as an example in the region?
Well, I think he's going to take a very hard hit, and that will be just fine for UMNO and Barisan Nasional, in the sense that they will say, well, he was repudiated by the voters, he's now gone to prison. That was him, that was a dark chapter, and we're really not that bad. It was all his fault. And I think they're going to try to hang everything they can on Najib. History belongs to the winners, and Najib is now a massive loser. And I think he is going to face a very, very difficult time of it, both he and his wife. And you know what? I guess Samnamna, he deserves it. He's gonna take the hit, and there it is. I think that ultimately, the big question for me is how much further does it go in terms of the anti-corruption agenda beyond Najib? How much other things are cleaned up? Or are we going to return to some sort of different version of go along to get along? And I'm hoping that we'll see some of the reforms that they're talking about in this massive document that I've spent the last day or two going through, because there is ultimately a prescription for a better Malaysia, one that is oriented towards reform, towards equal opportunity, towards better respect for worker rights, better respect for human rights. The question that the previous speaker mentioned in terms of immigration. Part of the discussion is really that they want to end the reliance on these foreign workers and try to find quality jobs for Malaysians. And one of the things that the government has pledged to do as part of its 10 pledges for the first 100 days is to revise the minimum wage upwards to 1,500 ringgit per month, you know, which would be revolutionary because, you know, back 5 years ago, they wouldn't even talk about a minimum wage. It was one of the few places in the region that didn't have a minimum wage. They do have a minimum wage now, but it, you know, it's wholly insufficient. So I'm hoping that there can be enough agreement on these sort of core areas beyond just sort of scoring political points, that, you know, reform goes beyond the sort of the political sort of what's politically convenient or politically easy to do, and that they actually sort of get into some of these more tough issues.
Right. Well, thank you. I think we've run the course. We've had a very long session. Jonathan has already left us. He's given up. That was not his crashed aeroplane in the picture. That's from his Facebook page or whatever. Bridget, it's midnight in Sydney, so we'll let you go to bed, and thank you very much for your generous contribution of time.
Godspeed, everybody. Take care.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Phil Robertson and Matthew Hayes, at the last minute. So this next Wednesday, the press crisis in Bangkok and Cambodia, Thailand.